Hello and welcome, I'm Rhys Janot and you're watching Know Your Stuff. Today I'm speaking with economist Pavlina Tcherneva. It's a two-part discussion about modern monetary theory and its principal policy prescription, the job guarantee. Pavlina Tcherneva, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I would like to start our conversation out with a little bit of background information on yourself, how you came to MMT and your work on the job guarantee.
Well, I started on this research as an undergraduate in college. I worked with a professor called Matthew Forstater. I read the general theory with him, and then he helped me get an internship, which was with somebody called Warren Mosler, whom a lot of people know now as one of the principal founders of modern monetary theory. And at the time, he had penned a pamphlet that outlined some basic principles of money, and I quickly realized that those principles of money are very fitting within the post-Keynesian framework, and wanted to find some of the similarities and some of the differences. And we organized a conference, you could call it the first MMT conference in '96 on the impending launch of the euro, to propose hopefully a coherent framework for understanding some of the difficulties with the monetary union and how it was designed and the absence of monetary sovereignty. So that was the beginning. That's when I met a lot of amazing scholars like Charles Goodhart, Randy Wray, eventually Bill Mitchell, Stephanie Kelton, and we decided to launch a research program at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. In the interim, I worked for the Levy Forecasting Center, which was using what is now known as the Godley model, sector balances model, or the Kalecki equation for forecasting. So little by little, this research really fit together, and the job guarantee was a key piece of the framework of analysis of how to ensure full employment and price stability.
There seems to be a lot of confusion between ideology and actual scientific economic theory. I think like of Marx's Capital, where people will say, well, Marxism is ideology. It's where it's actually a working theory of people's working lives in those days. Your colleague, for example, Bill Black, will call the neoclassical economists theoclassical economists, talking about ideology there. What is MMT and what is it not regarding theory versus policy prescription?
Well, the first and foremost thing, it's a framework for thinking about the economy. It is you could call it a paradigm, a new paradigm that attempts to explain the economy based on some obvious stylized facts that have been universally ignored by the profession. And so the first stylized fact is that the currency is a public monopoly. We talk about monopolies in our principles classes. We never actually theorize what does it mean for the public sector to have exclusive power over the currency. And then in the textbook, of course, we don't even talk about money very much. We tell these mythological stories of barter and Robinson Crusoe, and we know very well economists are the only ones who tell these stories. If we look at all other disciplines, they find no basis in reality. And so what does that mean for a discipline to be able to not be able to think about money in deeper ways, or to tell the wrong stories to our students from day one? So MMT is first and foremost a framework for understanding the possibilities, the mechanics, the plumbing of different monetary systems. Some countries have monetary sovereignty, others don't. We want to be able to understand the institutional intricacies there, the way that those institutional designs impact policy concretely, and then the lives of people. So that's first and foremost, and I think there's a fair amount of misunderstanding. People believe that we're proposing a new system. The second thing is that, of course, it does have somewhat emancipatory potential. Once you understand that money is not only a public, or at least the currency is not only a public monopoly, but money in the way it's created through the banking system, and there's plenty of work outside of MMT that has done that work, you suddenly understand that financing is not scarce. That is, I think, profound, because we have been so used to thinking in these scarcity terms that we are precluding a lot of economic possibilities by committing to these stories of gold, as if we have to find the money from somewhere and we don't actually have the power to create it.
There's a lot of opposition, it seems, to modern monetary theory. Some of the key arguments are interesting. For example, from the right, we claim that MMT is inflationary. From the left, it doesn't deal with democracy in the workplace or support for unionization and things like that. Both sides might say it's too statist or big government. Where does MMT fit?
All right, so MMT has been criticized for proposing runaway spending, which is precisely the opposite of what MMT is saying. MMT recognizes that the currency is not strictly limited, that there is no, hard boundary at which you have to stop expenditures in terms of nominal terms, in monetary terms. But we always emphasize that the real constraints are physical constraints, in terms of the productive resources of the economy. So they are very real constraints of what we can do. And so, in fact, what we're hoping to do is kind of demystify money and the fact that, we can and we do spend at will whenever we have policy priorities. We, of course, use the mythology of a scarcity of money to deny certain policy priorities. We fund others at will, financial bailouts, endless wars, you name it. So we see MMT in practice, on a daily basis. But what we are saying is that we want to move away the conversation from money. We want to move it to the things that we are actually doing, the public policies. So it is a bit of the irony of our name. It's called modern monetary theory, but it's not about money. It is about how we organize our daily life. How do we organize our economies? How do we create the good life? Okay, and that, in that sense, then the other criticism has been, well, are you just proposing big government just because the power rests within the public sector and the fiscal authority to create this unlimited financial resource? Are you proposing a status system? And so, if by status system we're talking about, the concentration of control, if we're talking about, a centralized powers and ownership of industry, well, I'm really describing the corporate sector, right? So we are living within a planning system, and we have accepted it as natural because we have denied the possibility of the public sector to play a role. And whether we talk about it or not, the public sector has an important macroeconomic function that it always exerts. And so we're saying you got to rehabilitate that function. We got to start talking about it in terms of what does it mean for a democracy? And then we got to democratize money. Now, what would that mean? That the power of the public purse then has to be employed for public needs and public goals and objectives. So whether that is, eliminating poverty, whether it is securing full employment, whether it is basic goods provisioning, whether it is a better system of organizing production. It is not necessarily a top-down system. It's a system that says, well, we are a polity, that we can then find new ways in which we can organize ourselves. And of course, that, in my work at least, I argue that policy has to be reoriented from the ground up, from the bottom up, instead of these top-down, trickle-down economics where we truly empower communities, people to do some of the basic organization of their lacking public goods, whether it is care, whether it is environmental renewal, whether it is cooperative arrangements. There are many ways in which we can organize the system, but we have to recognize that the public sector has a crucial resource that we all need, and it needs to be provided in a manner to fulfill the social objectives, whichever they are. And so I just want to say this about MMT, that we think that we are hoping to democratize that conversation. What can you ask of your government is when you understand what the government is actually, its capacity, its funding capacities. And so we don't ask certain things because we have consented to the false ideology that the government can run out of money, right? You can't fund social security. There's just not enough for housing for all. And that the problem is not financial, it's real.
Yeah, you see that sort of in the current crisis here, Corona, where all of a sudden they find money for I mean, it still seems to be the majority of it going to big corporations, but we'll get onto that perhaps in a second. But you mentioned before, just earlier, that some countries have sovereign monetary systems, others do not. What about Europe? How can MMT be applied to the situation here? And what, to your mind, needs to change in the monetary system in particular to end austerity here?
I mean, the monetary union is, in a way, an unprecedented arrangement of the separation of monetary and fiscal powers. So you have a union, I mean, outside of colonies, it's unprecedented. We have had, colonial systems that have used the currency of the colonies. So, but, notice how those colonies gained their independence. That process was never truly complete until they were able to finally get their own currency. And then they were tethered to the currency of, let's say, the British pound by currency boards, which essentially restricts the expenditure of the government of the newly formed nation states in a particular exchange rate with the British pound. And the way to get extra British pounds is to export your resources to the former colonial power in order to acquire their currency for the management of your domestic affairs. So that process of economic independence is not truly fully complete unless countries not only have their own currencies, but they untether from the currency of the colonial power. Now, so now we, in a very strange way, we have returned to like a system in which, presumably democratic system, in which you don't have one colonial power. People have consented to join a monetary union, and they have signed on to this project and said, okay, we will embrace the unity principle and the peace and collaboration principle, except we're embracing it with a monetary arrangement that is unworkable in a way, because we have a currency but without a fiscal authority that will spend it into existence. And so it becomes a bit of a Hunger Games of who's going to get the currency from country to country to be able to meet their economic objectives. And some countries do better than others, and we can go through all the reasons why that might be the case, but not every country can be like Germany. The principle of the European Union is such that the benefit within the Eurozone, one country might be a net importer, another one can be a net exporter, and whatever currency one obtains, another loses. There are some basic principles that will function, that will constrain expenditure within the Eurozone. And so what we've got now, and I think this is understood, I think finally there is a conversation that the fact that we don't have a fiscal union is a serious obstacle to bold recovery. But the way the fiscal union is being discussed is by contributions from individual states into a pool of funds. So again, we're working within a scarcity principle. We have only a fixed amount of money, and you gotta, in a depression or in a recession, you gotta put in your little pennies into this pot so that we can help the welfare of the system, instead of redesigning the institutions within the Eurozone, such as putting in place a treasury, putting in place a Ministry of Finance, having them coordinate with the central bank the way in sovereign nations governments coordinate with their own central banks to ensure that there's macroeconomic policy that is funded for the Eurozone level as a whole, and those checks don't bounce. We need to come to that, not just realization, but institutional architecture. I think, the political obstacles are great many, and short of doing something, the Eurozone will change, but under duress, and the outcomes might not be pretty.
On that note, we'll have to take a short break. We'll be back in 30 seconds in our conversation with Pavlina. See you in a second.
This is an act of pure journalism. Every journalist in the world should have been cheering Edward Snowden. He did what every journalist is supposed to be devoted to.
Because we have evidence that when we do that, things go wrong.
Welcome back to our conversation with Pavlina Tcherneva. We're continuing our two-part conversation on modern monetary theory and the job guarantee. Pavlina, one of the key things here, I think, is that governments, something that people need to understand about modern monetary theory is that governments don't tax and spend, they spend and tax. So here's something that's often confused me about left-wing politicians like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn. They still perpetuate this concept, and you've been an advisor for Sanders. They still perpetuate this tax and spend myth. And should any serious left party approach talk of public spending in this way?
I think it is a mistake. It is a difficult battle, I concede, when for generations people are educated or socialized into this notion that their tax dollars fund the public sector. It's quite difficult to change for a politician that narrative, but there are ways. And so, what MMT says, of course, if you are the source of the currency, you don't tax it from your population to fund yourself. You actually issue it, spend it first, and the population is able to pay taxes through it. And then folks often ask, but then why are we paying taxes if the government has the currency? And there is a long history that we can go through, but taxes really actually create that demand for the currency. They're a coercive tool for the demand for the currency that is being issued from the sovereign, but also historically they have been a source of transferring resources from the public sector to the from the private sector to the public sector. In other words, in a way to settle the tax, you have to deliver something to the state, whether it's work, whether it's labor, whether it is some sort of resource. So they're important there. And they have distributive functions, important distributive functions. They're not just a tool of, taxing those rents, right? Exploitative rents in the economy, but they also have distributive function of how we organize our production, who does the work, where do the resources come from? And so to come to that understanding is a bit difficult for the layperson. The economist should be doing that job. And the economist should be, explaining better, I think, that's the function of taxes. Now, when I worked for Sanders and with Stephanie Kelton in particular, my main contribution was on the issue of inequality and demonstrating the runaway inequality that we experience through government stabilization. In other words, government spending that attempts to stabilize an economy, and yet it produces and reproduces inequality on steroids. And so I think, Sanders for a very long time has been saying, look, the source of our difficulty is that there are some people that have way too much and some that don't have enough. But instead of framing it in terms of the real resources, in terms of the command over our democracy, in terms of the fact that they are under, he is obviously doing that. He was doing quite effectively that, workers are not are underpaid, etc. But that extra step that Sanders and Corbyn were doing is that they were saying we got to tax the rich to pay for our own policy priorities. And to me, that is a fundamental error because it tethers us. It is like an umbilical cord that we haven't cut to the to the wealthy that we need to cut. Because in other words, we are not able. It is sending the message that unless you can tax the wealthy, you cannot do what is right. And I think that is wrong. I think that we need to tell a different narrative of why we need to tax the wealthy. And MMT has attempted to do that, but it's not because we cannot afford to employ everyone or provide decent housing. So they have to be two battles in our mind. I think it's analytically correct. I think it's also strategically important.
So how is modern monetary theory already at least its policy prescriptions already be in use? It's not, they're not necessarily used for good, are they?
Well, as we were saying earlier, the power of the public purse is there. It has always served somebody's interests. And we are awakening to this issue only in times of crisis. During 2008 financial crisis, we overnight appropriated a very large budget to deal with the financial crisis and bail out the financial institutions. And at that time, you remember, Occupy, people were up in arms. They understood that overnight we can find the resources. We didn't call China. We didn't call any wealthy taxpayers or donors to fund our, the bailout. The money was there. When we do endless wars, people pay attention and say, hey, trillions of dollars. And now it's even clearer because, at least in the US, the CARES Act dwarfed anything that we had done overnight in our modern history outside of World War II. And so I think people are understanding when there's an objective, the money is there, the checks will not bounce, and it's already spent. So what do? We need to embrace the teachable moment and continue to carry it forward and simply say no to the question, how will you pay for it? Now, in Europe, it's difficult because, as we were just explaining, in Europe, there are such radical constraints on expenditure. They are by design. And so you literally have to say, let's throw the straitjacket and find a way to spend on as needed basis.
You mentioned this teaching moment. I think it's important to ask a question about education and educating the public in general, because I have the feeling, at least to me, it seems like at least the base concepts of modern monetary theory could easily be taught to teenagers. So, I mean, should this be being taught at high school level, and should students be demanding more modern monetary theory be taught at their universities and colleges?
I would think so. I mean, this is such a basic thing. Everybody carries notes and coins in their pockets, and we just don't pause to think where they come from. And we tell crazy stories about, digging them from the ground and gold coins. And we talk about a lot about financial literacy, but again, we don't pause to talk about the Fed and the Treasury and what they do and how they do it. And I should say, MMT has done quite, I think, has changed the conversation in considerable ways. And the first receptive audience were financial journalists and people from the Fed, because they deal with operations all the time. And so it's not so easy to pull the veil on top of them and say, oh, we don't have money. But the public seems to reproduce these myths. So yes, I think children need to be taught very early that, this is a piece of paper and it's printed, and money is not even printed physically, it's electronically created. I mean, just understanding how debits and credits work. These are such basic foundational principles everybody should know. We tell children accounting is important. Well, that's what sovereign currency is. It's an understanding of an accounting system. So yes, high schools, even earlier.
Pavlina Tcherneva, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for watching. You can find the link to the second part of our discussion in the description below. And please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click on the bell if you'd like to receive notification when we release new material. And if you like what you just saw and would like to help us in our work, you can do so by way of donation. You can find all the information about how to donate at acTVism.org. Thanks once again, and we'll see you next time.